Yeah, yeah. I hate writing out the directory path, but so as some people are kind of alluding to, like what's the benefit of doing this in R? So Nico did a really good job of like doing the pre-processing for everything that goes on. So a lot of what he was showing you was a lot of the stuff that goes into like for specifically for point data in getting it into the R environment, projecting it, making sure it's all ready to go for. Mine kind of picks up at where he leaves off. And what I wanted to do here is I wanted to give you two examples of how we can use R to perform spatial analyses. And since we've been working with point data today, I'm going to focus on two kinds of things that we can do to analyze point data. One where we care about, okay, where are the points in space, and we don't really care if there's any information that's associated with those points, which is good for things like I'm following an elk across the landscape. I want to know the position where it's at is the important question there. The other thing too is like if you've got field sites and they've got some kind of variable or something like that that's associated with them, how do we analyze those? How do we analyze that variable that's associated with those points? So density analysis and spatial interpolation are two good ways of looking at both of these questions. And a lot of what I really wanted to do is just kind of highlight the power of what there's like tons of different things that you can do, like regression analyses, spatial regression, stuff like that, using the same thing. So first thing that's important is make sure all these are loaded. What you can change your working directory. I just have this. I wrote it in on my home computer, and that's what the set working directory was. And like Nico did, I have a projected polygon that we can plot in space. It doesn't really matter what this is. What I'm gonna so most of this first code, since I don't really have a data set that's associated with this, I just went ahead and simulated some stuff. So if I'm just going to run through this real quick. If you have questions about what this is doing, it's kind of not the point. But what I'm going to do is just make a whole bunch of point data and plot it in space. So if you have any questions about what the simulation is doing, feel free to ask at the end. It requires two functions that I wrote in a second R file. If anybody's not familiar with what source does, you can type source and point it towards a file, and it'll input. It kind of runs that code directly into the R environment without you having to run it again. So this polysampler function, all it's doing is picking a spot. It's putting random points onto the data set based on the polygon data set that I pulled in. So I simulate a point from this red polygon, and I plot it in space. If you're doing this on your computer, that point may move from where mine is because it's random noise. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that to make a data set. So you can think about this kind of like, let's think about this as animal movements. So we have an initial spot for where an animal is on the landscape, and we have a data set that has that. And this animal can move a certain distance from the point, and it just kind of randomly moves from one point to the next. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sample this animal, say with GPS 100 times. And that's what this code is doing. So once I pull that, you can see that I've got the XY file similar to what Nico pulled in. And this can be, again, any kind of data that you're interested in, figuring out like where these points are. And we can plot them in space. So if this is say this is an elk, because this is an elk, this polygon relates to elk data that I work on. He started off in this polygon and kind of moved this way in space. It might move again a different direction for you. But a lot of times what we're interested in is like, where are most of these points occurring on a map? So this is a good way of looking at that is doing something like kernel density estimation or some kind of density analysis. And this is one of the functions that I use a lot to look at where the most intensity is in terms of like where this animal is moving around at. So a kernel density estimator is going to simply give you what this two-dimensional surface that shows the probability of by pixel of where those points are in space. So it's a kind of very basic exploratory point process analysis. So I'll explain what this is doing. I want to make sure that I'm not analyzing anything outside of the space of these points. So this ext object that I'm working with here, it's a function in the raster package. So anytime you see this double spot, I'm simply just telling you what package I drew that function from. And that'll give you this object over here that gives you the min and max xy coordinates. And I'm making a bounding box polygon here to show you where these points are. So you can kind of see that it makes this box in space to kind of constrain the analysis to within that. So now I want to know where the most likely spot is that I'm going to find this elk based on this point data set. Kernel density estimator needs a couple things. It needs you to have this smoothing parameter called a bandwidth. And again, all this code is doing, if you can read about this in a lot of papers that use kernel density estimators, it's just kind of choosing the optimal bandwidth by minimizing the mean square error. So it's going to pick this point right here. And that's going to be used in this function from the Splanks package. So kernel 2D is a really easy way of doing a kernel density estimator to look at the density of these points. So I've got my points as the first argument here. I've got that bounding box that tells you where the points are and where we want to perform this analysis at. This H0 is the bandwidth estimator that we got from this code up here. And then this is just the number of cells that are going to be created in this analysis. So this is just like I'm creating 1,000 lines through that bounding box in the X direction. I'm creating 1,000 lines in the Y direction, and it's going to make that two-dimensional space. So I'm going to hit that, doing the quarter kernel, give you that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make that into a raster so I can plot it. So again, here's our polygon, and then you can use the R. You can use R to plot this in space. So I'm going to add those points back in. Points data. So you can see what it's doing is, I'm going to pull this up. Actually, I can't. You can see kind of what it's doing is it's looking at the total number of points that you've mapped here, and it's saying, okay, the highest density, which is represented by this green color, is, you can see that it corresponds where the most of those points are occurring in space. So it's a really cool way of like summarizing the spread and the distribution of your point data. Which can be really helpful for a lot of different things. So like I'm interested in where, say, a species of plant is occurring on the landscape, and I'd have a whole bunch of estimates that are ones and zeros, and I care about, 1 is it's present, 0 is it's absent. I can plot all those spots where it's present to kind of get an estimate of, what's the probability of finding that thing if I took a random sample within that bounding box. So I do this a lot for just kind of mapping out point estimates. Again, you can kind of look at there's a lot of literature on kernel density estimators, so you can find like exactly what it's doing. But it's a really quick thing that you can do in R to kind of summarize your point data. The second one that I wanted to kind of highlight was what happens if you have something associated with those points. So say you, I don't know anything other than animal science. Like, I don't know, you go out and you're interested in some concentration of nutrient or mineral in the soil, and you go out and sample the landscape at a bunch of different locations, and you get some concentration of whatever you're trying to measure there, and you want to say, okay, how do I summarize this? How do I get a summary of this, and what's the probability if I go out and just like randomly sample the landscape based on my data, what am I going to find? So a good way of looking at that is spatial interpolation. What that's going to do is it's going to take that data that's associated with your point values, your point data set, and kind of and map it to unsampled areas to kind of get an idea of where, like what's going on in those unsampled areas. So kind of similar to what we did with the kernel density estimator, I'm going to make an extent of the area that I'm interested in. This GRD object in this expand grid function is going to do something similar to what this NX and NY does. It's just going to simply make a grid cell that overlays your polygon. And the reason that's important is we need pixels to assign values to. And I forget why I made this N, but I need it for something, so I'll put it there. What I'm doing here is a lot of the times when we sample something on the landscape, values are going to be correlated to each other based on like site locality. So all this is doing is generating a data set that is spatially autocorrelated. So if this value is green, it's more likely to have green cells around it. If this one's the salmon color, it's more likely to have like values around it. So I'm just making some data up so that we can play with it. And you can kind of see how that situates within the polygon that we have there. So again, I'm just gonna don't do that. Hit the wrong button. So this is I'm just going to kind of make up a random sample. So I'm making my point data set up again. Again, don't have to worry about what it's actually doing. Essentially, all it's going to do is plot a bunch of points. So that I'm just kind of pulling like here's my sampling scheme, and it's randomly sampling across the landscape. And I want to associate data with those sampling localities. So a good way to do that is this extract function. So say you have some kind of underlying landscape characteristic like that made-up data set that I showed you. Essentially what we can do is we can use these points in the extract function to pull the values for that data, for whatever the underlying data is using the extract function. And it's kind of similar. There's a similar thing in ArcGIS. All it's getting is those pixel values. So I'm pulled those values out. Yeah, yeah. And what I want to do now is figure out how these data play out in space. So I'm going to use this inverse distance weighting spatial interpolation method. It's a really simple thing where it just kind of says, as I move out along that grid, there's going to be some kind of spatial decay in terms of like what the expected value is. The more closer you're to that point, the more likely you're going to be like that point. And as you move out from that, the less likely you're going to be. So I forget if I ran this or not, but I'm going to do this. A lot of this is just processing. So I'm just saying, I'm making these coordinate files, the actual XY points, and then the centroids of the grids that I made, where I want to expand this data out to, or the sample out to. And then the big one is this inverse distance weighting function. It performs that analysis. And then we can make that into a map. So I'm just extracting here the expected values for each of the grid cells from that grid based on the actual observed data. And this is all contained in the IDW object. It's a spatial points data frame. So it would look a lot, if I opened it up, it would look a lot like what Nico showed you earlier. And then I'm going to make it into a raster so that I can compare it to the underlying. So this is just processing the raster. I'm snapping it to, essentially it's like the clip function in ArcGIS. I'm clipping it to the extent of the data because you don't want to interpolate data outside of the domain of which you sampled it from. This is scaling the plot function. So cuts is giving you bins for like what the color should be for the values. And this is just telling it which colors I want it to be. So I'm making a ramp palette from white to black. So white would be low, black would be high. And then this is essentially what I'm doing here is just going to plot them together. So I want to make two distinct plots. And that's what this par MFRO does. So if I call that, it's going to make one plot. This is the interpolated data. And then this is the real data. So you can see kind of like the power of what we're doing here. We took a subsample of what's going on over here based on those points that we laid down, and then used interpolation to kind of map that out in space and say, hey, what if I sampled away from the points that I did, what's the expected values I'm going to get? And you can see in a lot of cases that it does a really good job of kind of guessing what the value should be. So you get this density of green here that is observed in the real data set, similar things going on with this salmon color. But like up here, if you don't have a high density of sampling points, it's gonna be a problem. But this is a really, again, another way of visualizing point data that has some kind of variable of interest associated with it. So the difference then, again, kernel density estimator, we care only about where the points are in space. This, we care about spatially representing what data is associated with those points. And again, I'd put a lot of code up here, and I realize that the most important functions to understand if you're looking to do these kind of analysis is that KDE function. Kernel 2D, if we're using the Splinks package. And this creates the parameters that we're basing that visualization off of. Down here, the inverse distance weighting thing does the same thing, the IDW function, and everything that comes before that is processing the data so that's ready to use for that. It's important to note that you can't just like a lot of times that this IDW and other kinds of spatial interpolation rely on some kind of function. So all I'm doing here is telling it that it's like a like for like. Essentially, it would be, if I could, it would be the same as doing that and just passing the actual data through. But since it needs a function, I just put a 1, that squiggly line 1, which says just use the data. The other important parameter that I didn't mention here for IDW is the IDP. This is a weighting function, so it's setting the exponential curve for our what the distance decay is for this stuff for your data. So I know that's a lot, but I wanted to give you code that you can play with on your own for two really important ways of like visualizing and doing some basic analyses on point data. If you have any questions, feel free to, if you ever have to run it yourself, feel free to email me. Like, did you have a question?
No, I wanted to know what X raster was, the object that you